Good morning readers, it's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf and welcome to a slightly more normal bookish breakfast. So we arrived back from Turkey late last night and I'm wearing my dressing gown because it's freezing in England. I don't know if you can see out of the window there, but it's also very wet and rainy, which is slightly different from what we've been used to. So the only book that I managed to finish The Colour of Magic as well, but the book that I'm going to be talking about today is The Hobbit by Tolkien, because we managed to finish it yesterday on our flight home, quite fittingly because of course Bilbo returns home at the end, and so did we. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the adaptations of The Hobbit, the recent adaptation of The Hobbit. So the version that we listened to was a very good narration by Andy Serkis, who plays Gollum in the most recent films. And the films have obviously been at times a little bit controversial because they do change quite a lot of stuff and they do go on for quite a long time. But we really like the films, aside from a few moments of extreme ridiculousness. So while we've been listening to it, we've been talking about what things work well in the adaptations and what things don't. There are definitely going to be spoilers for The Hobbit books and films in this. But yeah, I thought it could be potentially interesting if you've watched the films and or read the books. Read the book. So from the book is very definitely the thing that you notice when you read this if you have watched the films. And I've read this, I think, twice since the films came out, once maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, and once obviously as a child. The thing that you notice is it is very definitely a children's book. The style of narration is much more similar to sort of C.S. Lewis than it is to The Lord of the Rings. It's very much addressed to young children, and although Bilbo, the main character, is a fully grown man when he sets out on his expedition, a fully grown hobbit I should say, he is talked about as this kind of like, he's almost treated as a child to start with, and then he kind of comes into his own as the journey goes on. The films, although they have humorous moments, they're a little bit too dark and dramatic for it to really be aimed at children. They change substantial aspects of the plot in order to tie in better with The Lord of the Rings. So there is a mention in The Hobbit of a character called the Necromancer, and there is a mention of the fact that Gandalf goes and tackles this Necromancer and dispels them from the area of Mirkwood. And there is a talk about how, you know, they wish he'd been exiled from the world, but that's not going to happen for a while. But it's not clear when you read that Tolkien at that point had a very fixed idea of where he was going to go with The Lord of the Rings. Obviously, Middle-earth was something that he'd been working on for a very long time. He had a substantial idea of some of the myths and legends, particularly the maps and the languages, which is often where he started with his ideas. But it doesn't feel like he had the details of that plan worked out. And I suppose working in a world where we do have the whole story and we do have the whole plot line, they kind of had to change little aspects to make it fit together a little bit better. There's also, for instance, mentions of, at the end, of how like nearly all of the goblins are killed and there's no goblins in the Misty Mountains for years and years and years. But obviously we know 60 years later, Frodo goes into the Misty Mountains and confronts quite a lot of goblins. That's not exactly an issue that they resolve in the films, but they do make the major armies that they face not be the goblin army, so you're kind of left with the idea that there are still goblins there. Yeah, so other major things that they change. Should we talk about Tariel for a bit? This is this female elf character that is created to give a bit of a romantic storyline, and she falls in love with one of the young dwarves that's Philly or Killy, like I should really know, I think it's Philly. Basically, there's a pair of younger dwarves that are always mentioned together. In the books, they are also always mentioned together. They're the two young ones. They're kind of like the boldest and the bravest. And of the 12 dwarves, they are the ones that are the most... they're some of the ones that are the most characterised, because a lot of the dwarves are really just kind of like cut-out figures who don't really need to be... they're not really distinctive characters exactly, and that's true in the book and the film. So in terms of latching a more detailed storyline onto any of the dwarves, it does make sense for it to be one of the ones that we kind of know a little bit better, that has this kind of like young, active character. I actually quite like it. I quite like the character of Tariel, and I definitely like there being an actual female character in the movies, which there isn't really in the books. But I do think it should have been handled slightly differently, because there's this kind of weird situation where Legolas is added into the films. He's not in the books at all. I don't really mind that. Again, it's kind of like a bit of continuity. It's not necessary, but it's there. And he's in love with Tariel, but Tariel's in love with Philly, and it's a bit weird. But at the end, Tariel survives and she's heartbroken, and Legolas kind of just decides he's not really in love with her anymore, and goes away into the north, apparently, to meet Aragorn. I think if this is the storyline they're going to go with, I feel like it would have made more sense for Tariel to have died, and then Legolas wouldn't have been left with this slightly weird storyline where he'd been kind of in love with this girl, but now he's not. Because when we do see elf relationships in these books, they tend to be really powerful, and they last for a very long time, and they tend to be kind of for life, if that makes sense. They don't seem to just have trivial crushes. They seem to really commit to their relationship. So it's just like a little kind of, they're trying to create some continuity, but they're actually creating a little glitch as well. In terms of if you were gonna, if I was gonna plan an adaptation, which obviously I'm not, and I was gonna add some female characters into The Hobbit, I would change some of the dwarves, because we do have mentions of the fact that there are female dwarves, and that they behave quite a lot like dwarf men. So you've got 13 dwarves. 13, 12? It's 13 including The Hobbit. You've got 12 dwarves. You're obviously not going to change Thorin. You probably wouldn't change Bomber. I'm going to talk about Bomber in a minute. But then you've got like a whole scope, a whole range of dwarves that you could have, even if it was just like 3 or 4 of them are women. And that could be part of the joke, that like they're women, but they also, because, you know, it's stated in the films, in the later films, that dwarf women look quite a lot like dwarf men. So that, you know, you could definitely build on that, and they wouldn't have to be like, it would be a very easy way of doing it, because they don't have such explicit characters. So yeah, so you could do that as well as introducing a love interest if you wanted to. But yeah, that was something that we were talking about that we kind of felt would have been a very easy thing to do. So Bomber, I said I was going to talk about. So Bomber is one of the dwarves that is actually pretty well defined in The Hobbit as a book, and he basically doesn't really figure that much in the films. So the initial characterization of Bomber in the book is that he's the fattest hobbit, and you can definitely see that that wouldn't be necessarily a characterization that would go down well in modern times, but that's not the entirety of who he is. So he starts out as being just like known as the fattest, did I call him a hobbit a second ago? The fattest dwarf. Going well. So yeah, Bomber is the fattest dwarf. And that's the thing that we latch onto to start with, or that's the thing that we're pointed out to start with. But then he has like a number of like incidents that go along with him that are kind of like partially linked to his weight, but not generally. For instance, he is carrying Bilbo through the goblin tunnels and he drops him. That's like a noticeable thing. And that's why Bilbo goes on to have his adventures with Gollum, whereas in the films, they kind of just have Bilbo tackled by a goblin and then he falls off a walkway. So there's less of that, like, dramatic, emotional, oh, I'm trying to hold on to him and he just fell. Whereas in the films, if anyone's trying to hold on to somebody who's falling, they're just absolutely fine. And they manage to pick them back up again, because that's how that kind of thing works. And then later on, as they're going through the Mirkwood, Bomber falls into a river and is put into an enchanted sleep, and then they have this running joke that he's always trying to get back to sleep and trying to get his dreams back, because he had these amazing dreams while he was in this enchanted sleep. And again, that just completely goes, and it's weird that they turn this tiny book into a 3 full-length film series, and not only do they lose the entire enchanted sleep issue, but they lose all of the character that specific individual had. And it's a bit of a shame, really. Like, like I said, not many of the dwarves really have that much to go on, but Bomber really did, and he kind of gets a bit shafted. I can kind of, to a certain extent, I can see why they took some of the enchanted sleep stuff out, because in the book it involves them carrying him while he's asleep for like days on end, and like scenes of him being a bit grumpy when he wakes up and stuff, and perhaps they thought that that wouldn't make particularly compelling viewing, but I think it could have worked if it wasn't like a big deal, but just like a part of the hardship that they go through in the forest. They also made it seem like a much shorter length of time. So this is another kind of issue, I guess, with translating the book into the film, because Tolkien is very careful to be quite accurate with his descriptions of what it's like to be in a small group that's going on a very, very, very long march. And he talks a lot about how the impact of being cold and wet and hungry affects them. They're hungry quite a lot in this book, which is reasonable. He talks about like when they have provisions and when they have shortages of provisions, and when the only provisions that they have is a horrible little bread called cram. And he is very careful to talk about how that affects their morale, and how that affects like what their expectations are and what they're worried about and what their focus is for the next stage of their journey. That completely goes out of the film. Like, you wouldn't know that they were ever really hungry. You wouldn't really realise that they were carrying all of their food. And it makes it a lot less realistic. I think one of the things I like about The Hobbit as a book and Tolkien as an author is he doesn't gloss over these things and focus on too much of the magic and the battles and so on. He really goes into... Yeah, he kind of like brings his, I'm assuming, some of his own experiences into that impression that we get of how grueling it is to just walk day after day and try and aim for like a single purpose. I guess the other feature of Tolkien's writing that is altered in the films is he is fond of a little song. And they're not all the time, but you're just... every now and then come across a little, which Andy Serkis did quite a good job of reading through. But like, Bilbo's fighting the spiders, right? And he just stops for a while and tells them a little rhyme. Like, why not, okay? So they did that in the first film. They kind of went fully into it, and it's kind of almost semi-musical, but then they kind of ditched them in the later films, and I think that went with the atmosphere that they were trying to create. But it is kind of a shame, because some of Tolkien's lyrics are pretty good. Some of them, if you get to the elves, there are sections where the elves just say like fa la 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 la, which I felt a little... yeah, here it is. With tra la 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 lally, come back to the valley, tra la 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 lally, fa la 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 lally, fa la. Yeah, he kind of ran out of ideas for the end of that one, didn't he? Yeah, so I think they kind of did what they had to do in order to make it into a modern adult film, a modern film aimed at adults. But yeah, they missed some of his poetry and lyrics, but he does sometimes overdo that, so I'm not particularly bothered about that. Just thinking about the elves just then, the elves in the book are this kind of like really jolly, light-hearted people, and they completely changed that for the films. Like, the atmosphere of the elvish kingdoms and the elvish peoples is significantly different. They're much more like serene and calm, and they have much more presence, I suppose, and they're much less jolly. And I think that is because of how the idea of elves that we have as readers and viewers has changed over time, because elves, when Tolkien was working on them, the kind of like elves that you see in fairy tales and folklore are quite different from the elves that you see in fantasy books, which came, a lot of it, from Tolkien, but kind of has moved more and more into them being these kind of really skilled fighters and like statespeople and like dignified serious folk, whereas they're not very serious in The Hobbit. I can't really remember how serious they are in The Lord of the Rings, but I feel like they are more jolly than they are in the films, where they are presented like with all their like very, very elegant outfits and so on. Yeah, I had something else to say a minute ago when I was thinking about songs, but I can't remember it just right now. There were other little changes that we think improved the films. Not that the book isn't really great, but to make it into a film, it was quite nice to have the kind of dragon's curse working on Thorin's mind a little bit increased, because it makes us a bit more sympathetic towards him when he is suddenly becoming weirdly stubborn and unpleasant. You kind of they played up the kind of the mind aspect of it, of how it was he was almost being manipulated by the gold, and that is mentioned in the book, but it comes out more in the film, I think. We kind of liked the ending. Thorin's ending is a little bit clearer in the films. It does go on for a little bit too long, so does the entire battle, but I'll come to that in a sec. But yeah, the way that Bilbo and Thorin interact at the end of the film is more emotional than the way they interact in the end of the book, where Bilbo he's knocked out for the entirety of the battle, and then he comes and finds Thorin in a tent dying, and then they have their little friendly revision of their debates. I think it was more emotional in the film. I liked the wrap-up that Tolkien gave Thorin in the book, where he talked about him being buried with the Arkenstone, which then resolves the dispute over it. In the film, it's just kind of like dropped as an idea, and you know, you've spent they big it up a lot more, and they spend a lot more time talking about the Arkenstone, but then at the end they just stop talking about it and don't bother with it anymore, which is a bit odd. Yeah, battle scenes was one of the things I was going to talk about. So I was saying Tolkien spends a lot more time thinking about how hungry people are and how cold people are and so on, and a lot less time writing about the drama of the battle and so on. The film obviously does completely the opposite, because the entire last film is essentially battle scenes. Like, there's a really good bit at the beginning where you have Smaug fighting Lake Town, and it's cinematically beautiful and quite exciting, and then you have this like very, very long battle that just kind of goes on and on and on. It's a bit troublesome. And in the book he talks a little bit about the strategy and like how the battle is laid out and what happens, and then Bilbo gets knocked out and he wakes up, and the battle is over and it's the next day. Could potentially have done with a tiny bit more. For instance, he just says that Fili and Kili are killed. In the film, it's good to have those characters wrapped up and to see their actual deaths. I think that's something that we've come to expect from characters that we've had made into significant characters for us. But it didn't need to be as extensive as it was in the film. So yeah, the battles, it's kind of like it could be a blend of the movie and the book for like the ideal adaptation version. But as a reader, I don't really enjoy reading long battle scenes, so I do prefer the book's approach to that. So yeah, so those were some probably more thoughts than you were particularly worried about on The Hobbit and its adaptation. Haven't seen any other adaptation. I'm not sure if there is one. I definitely can't read the book now without reflecting on the adaptation, because it does make so many changes and it is such a different thing, but an enjoyable thing to me. I'm not even going to talk about the really weird, silly moments where Legolas runs up falling buildings and it's all just a bit ridiculous. But yeah, we do enjoy watching it every now and then. They're not as good in terms of as films as The Lord of the Rings. Definitely the last one drags a little bit. And I think you could have condensed it and put it into 2 films instead of 3. I mean, you could have done it in 1 film, but in order to give it the length and development they chose to give it without it dragging in places, they could have made it into a 2-part film. At which point, I don't know which point they would break it at. Maybe escaping from the Elven King's dungeons, I suppose, potentially. I don't know. Anyway, so if you have read The Hobbit and watched the adaptations and you have any opinions on what I have said, if you want to correct me on all of my really shoddy knowledge of Tolkien, please comment down below, and I look forward to speaking to you soon. So it's currently Victober and I haven't said anything about that, but I'm hoping to make some more Victorian related videos sometime in the near future. So take care everyone, bye.